This is a test. Testing the microphone. Testing the microphone here. Want to see how we do. Testing it for Connie. Hopefully it'll work.
All right, hello, welcome back. My name is Connie Nielsen. I am the Director of Classical Education at St. Ambrose Academy here in Madison, Wisconsin. I also hold a Ph.D. in Religious Studies from Marquette University, and my emphasis was on Catholic social teaching. My dissertation covers the 100-year tradition beginning with Rerum Novarum and at that point ending with Centesimus Annus. This is the second class in this Seat of Wisdom series, and today we're focusing on Rerum Novarum, the Magna Carta, as it is called, of modern Catholic social teaching. Again, called modern Catholic social teaching, not because the church has never had a social teaching until the modern times, but because this specific application of the gospel message to the problems of the world came about during a radical transformation of the political and economic structures, at least in the West. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. So the focus today is Rerum Novarum. We're going to look at some of the principles of social teaching that come out of this document. We sadly will not be able to hit all of them. I was going over Rerum Novarum, getting ready for this class, and looking at all the beautiful passages that aren't in this packet that I wish we could talk about. But as it is, there's probably more here than we're actually going to be able to get to in the time that we have. But as we go along, each week, if you look at the outline of the course, we're focusing on a different one of the social encyclicals, going through chronologically. And some things that we don't get to that are in Rerum Novarum, we will get to at some other point. We'll look at a passage today. I'll point out, if I remember at the time, that this is sort of the nascent germ of solidarity. But I'm not going to talk a lot about solidarity at this time because we're going to talk a lot about it with John Paul II. So as we go along and we cover the different principles, my goal is to look at the ones that are really specific to that document. But I will keep, as we go forward, I'll keep pointing back. So when we start talking about solidarity with John Paul II, first I'll do a little, romp through the encyclicals that preceded it, show you how it has been a part of the tradition all along, and then look at how it is focused on by John Paul II. So we'll look at some of Rerum Novarum's principles today, some of the ones that are really best addressed in this document. I also told you last week that ideally what you would do, given all the time in the world and no other responsibilities, is read the encyclical that we're going to focus on before you get here. Again, that's not necessary. You'll benefit because we have the packet. But just to sort of give you a context for thinking about it, this is Rerum Novarum, right, in bound form, not gigantically, I'm not asking you to read Augustine's Confessions before you get here, or the City of God, right? This is only 54 pages and it's this big, right? This will change, of course, as we get to John Paul II. He usually has a little bit more to say, a little bit more of a circular way of saying it. But don't think, oh, she wants me to read something. There's no way I could read this, so I'm not even going to look into it. I want you to look into it because they are really manageable. Okay, so the name of this class that was determined upon was Charity and Justice. And, excuse me, these are the two, if we could boil Catholic social teaching down to two principles, it would be these two, justice and charity. And so these are the two principles that consistently inform what the Church is saying about building a good society. When we get to John the 23rd, we will talk a little bit about how he adds to this list truth and freedom. Then we'll start talking about charity, justice, truth, and freedom. And it's not because truth and freedom weren't already a part of the picture. They are implied by the virtues of charity and justice. They just start to get focused on more specifically, beginning with John the 23rd and moving forward. Justice and charity still remain the fundamental virtues that we want to be inspired by as we try to create the good society. When we read Rerum Novarum, or any of the encyclicals that are written on the anniversary of Rerum Novarum, sometimes, depending upon your personality and your own, what attracts you, they can seem a little technical and dry and far removed from the ideas of having concern for the poor. Pope Leo XIII, great man. When he was a cardinal, he ran a soup kitchen out of his own home, right? Or maybe when he was bishop in Perugia. I'm trying to remember, but he got, like he inherits this palace that they lived in, and it opens up a soup kitchen and starts feeding the poor outside of his home. Because his mother did that. She ran a soup kitchen out of her house. But this teaching is not necessarily about opening up soup kitchens. We're not reading, Blessed Teresa of Calcutta. The focus here is on justice at this point. What is a just society? What is our obligation to struggle for justice? And so sometimes we can read about these things and think, well, yeah, but where's the love of this? Where's the gospel here? Where's the Beatitudes? This is all very dry, political, economic, right? But the thing we have to keep in mind is that besides the fact that God is just, and so we want to reflect that justice in the way we order human society, the struggle for justice is always concern for the poor. Because if there is injustice, the poor and the vulnerable are the ones who suffer the most from it. They are the ones who suffer. People who are in a position of strength, in a position of wealth, a position of power, can get by better in an unjust system. They can even perhaps get the injustice of it working for their favor. It's the poor and the vulnerable who pay the price for an unjust society, or pay the greatest price. And so the pursuit of justice, even when it becomes quite technical, is always in service of the poor. It is concern for the poor. Justice, the church says, I believe Paul VI was the first to put it in these words. Benedict XVI quoted him in his social encyclical, "Justice is the minimum measure of charity." So if we say that we have love for our neighbor, at the very least, our concern is that they are receiving what they're due. Of course, we hope to go beyond that and sacrificially give them more than merely what they're due. Right? But at the very least, we should be concerned that they receive what is theirs, what they are due. Justice is the minimum measure of charity. But it doesn't mean that charity is completely outside of the picture here either. In two senses, charity shows up in Catholic social teaching. One is the more colloquial understanding of charity as almsgiving. And the teaching is very clear that no matter how just our structures get, There will always be need for that kind of charity. We're not going to get it so perfect that we're not going to need to have charity of that kind as part of the picture of the good society. Laws alone don't make a good society, no matter how just they are. And then charity is also in place as more of the mother of all virtues kind of charity. That as Christians, all of our actions should be inspired by that love. Whether it's for better laws or to open a soup kitchen, it is that mother of all virtues charity that inspires what we do, or ought to inspire what we do. Love of God and love of neighbor. So sometimes when we see the word charity in the teaching, they're talking more specifically about almsgiving, and then it sounds like justice and charity are these two different things, and we do both of these things. But other times charity refers more specifically to the double commandment of love of God and neighbor, and then it's the whole picture. It inspires my fight for justice. It inspires my desire to sacrificially lay down my life for, my friends. And there's an interesting sort of tension within the discussion of social teaching or social justice or social change between justice and charity that can be a little frustrating if you encounter it. There are those who are very committed to pointing out that Catholic social teaching is not just about opening soup kitchens. It is about looking at the structures that our society runs on and making sure that they are just. And so John Paul II talks about the need to look to structural change. If there are unjust structures, we need to identify them and see what we can do to correct them. And that can be overlooked because we get caught up in the idea that, if I send money to, charitable organizations, and if I volunteer at the Crisis Pregnancy Care Center, I am doing my job, and ignore all of these problems in society that need correction. But then what kind of happens with that group, sometimes they'll get this attitude as though charity is to be dismissed as insufficient. Right? We want just structures. Mother Teresa, I read this book once that was arguing that Mother Teresa did not have civic virtue because she always says, I don't care about that stuff. Right? You might want to fight for social justice. That's great. We need people doing that. That's not my thing. I mean, that's really how she puts it. And so then the people who are fighting for structural change will look at Mother Teresa and think, well, that's inadequate. Right? That's now only charity isn't good enough. Right? So we want to learn from the church how both of these things are necessary for the good of society. And understanding that charity is more perfect because it should inspire everything that we do. This love of God and neighbor should inspire everything that we do. Excuse me. Two more things before we, oh, thank you, sister. Two more things before we get into the principles and the document itself. One of the things that we're not going to get to in Rerum Novarum, just because we'll probably run out of time, is the teaching in opposition to the class struggle view of the Communist Manifesto. We looked at that last month and read, I read that opening line about how the history of all hitherto whatevers is the class struggle. That humanity and human history is marked by this struggle between the classes. and the goal of having the proletariat finally be victorious in this war. And the church completely rejects that understanding of human society and that understanding of human society. Did I say society twice? The human person. Not dismissing the fact that there has been conflict and that there is often inequity, but that the goal is not victory in a war between two parties. The goal is harmony amongst all of the different spheres of society. The image of the body in 1 Corinthians 12, where all the parts are working together for the good of the whole. We will not get into that, even though it is really beautifully expressed in Rerum Novarum. We will be looking at that question, though, when we get to John Paul II, because he also has a beautiful response to that in Laborem Exercens. And so when we get to that, I'll try to work in some of the passages from Rerum Novarum to show you the consistency of the church in that issue. Sorry, I haven't spoken out loud all day, and so I haven't cleared my throat yet. And finally, I just want to say a little bit about the historical context in 1891 when this was written. I talked a little bit last time about Adam Smith and the principles of Adam Smith and how they played out in the world, and then Karl Marx as a response, and then the church comes in and gives its response. But there was something else interesting going on at the time that marks modern Catholic social teaching, besides the Industrial Revolution and the principles of liberal capitalism, and that is the rise of secular government. This is the era in which the kings were being deposed and different forms of secular government, we call them, were coming into existence. So this is where the discussion of church and state started becoming really fascinating, at least in Western Europe. Again, at this time, it's pretty limited to a Western historical context. And the secular governments, as they came into power, were a little defensive about the role of the church in society. If you read the history of the late 19th century, there was a great attack on the social presence of the church, not just the faith, but on the church's social existence. The secular governments, most of them in the Western Europe, as they came into power, their first order of business was usually to confiscate all the property of the church. Many of these countries would exile the religious orders. Say that, you know, the Benedictines can no longer operate in France, you all have to get out. You know, or in Germany or in Italy. And the state then took over all of these beneficial works that the church had been offering to society. They took over the hospitals. They took over the schools. They took over the task of charitable aid. They took over the regulating of marriage. Right? All of these different things that had been really the province of the church up until that point now was a government issue. And so that had a big effect, too, on how society was ordered, as you might imagine. There's a lot of talk, even today, we are trying to figure out, you know, who more effectively runs a hospital? Who more effectively can see to the needs of the poor? A government organization or, you know, a charitable nonprofit organization? This wouldn't have been a question prior to that. It would have been assumed that it was all being handled by a charitable nonprofit organization. So the rise of secular government really makes that a big part of the question. And what is charity in terms of almsgiving once it becomes something that is part of the legislative process. So that's just a little context for you as we go into Rerum Novarum. You can turn to the first page there. The page numbers continue from your packet last week, so if you put them all together, they should go sequentially. This first passage that we're going to look at from Rerum Novarum is one of my favorite in all of Catholic social teaching. And again and again and again, in my own mind, I come back to this. And so the church aims higher still has become for me sort of a catchphrase for a lot of different principles that run through the teaching. It also shows a fundamental understanding of this relationship between justice and charity that I was just talking about, and justice as the minimum measure. We'll get a little bit of the rejection of class conflict here at the start of number 19, there on page 13. The great mistake made in regard to the matter now under consideration is to take up with the notion that class is naturally hostile to class, and that the wealthy and the working men are intended by nature to live in mutual conflict. So irrational and so false is this view that the direct contrary is the truth. Just as the symmetry of the human frame is the result of the suitable arrangement of the different parts of the body, so in a state is it ordained by nature that these two classes should dwell in harmony and agreement, so as to maintain the balance of the body politic. Each needs the other. Capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital. Mutual agreement results in the beauty of good order, while perpetual conflict necessarily produces confusion and savage barbarity. Now, in preventing such strife as this, and in uprooting it, the efficacy of Christian institutions is marvelous and manifold. First of all, there is no intermediary more powerful than religion, whereof the church is the interpreter and guardian, in drawing the rich and the working class together, by reminding each of its duties to the other, and especially of the obligations of justice. So there we have, first off, one of the many references the church will make to the need for religion to solve the social question. You remember last time I talked about principles versus application and my own focus on principles. This is one of the principles. That the social question, as it is called, is not going to be solved by merely political and economic study. Religion is necessary. And here Leo XIII is saying it is because there is no intermediary more powerful than religion in drawing the rich and the working class together, by reminding each of its duties to the other, and especially of the obligations of justice. So class conflict, which he started out rejecting, assumes that competing interests resolve the conflict by one person getting their way and the other person losing. And the Pope here is saying that's not the case. Competing interests, the conflict is resolved by a just solution, right, that all can adhere to, that all can agree to. And the church has a big role in reminding us of what is just. And then he goes on to list the duties of justice between worker and employer in number 20, which I cut out. The employer ought to do these things. He owes his workers these things. He can't do these things. An employee owes his boss these things in justice. These are the duties and responsibilities, and this is how harmony will be kept. And then he says at the end of 20, I should have put this line in here. Actually, see if I have it, because it's a great line, and I'd hate to misquote it. He lists all these precepts. And then he says at the end of 20, could not the observance alone of the foregoing laws remove the bitterness and the causes of conflict? Could not the observance alone of the foregoing laws remove the bitterness and the causes of conflict? So if we could simply follow these duties of justice, couldn't that alone resolve the struggle between these two groups? Then he says in 21, but the church, with Jesus Christ as her master and guide, aims higher still. She lays down precepts yet more perfect and tries to bind class to class in friendliness and good feeling. We're going to look at this passage again when we hear about solidarity, because this is what John Paul II refers back to when he makes his case for how solidarity has been a part of the teaching all along. Because the dictates of justice, as necessary and as good as they are, and wouldn't they get rid of the strife, don't go as far as Christ would have us go. Because justice is just an obligation that I'm required to fulfill. Right? It's not one of the theological virtues. Charity, however, inspires me to love my neighbor. I don't just pay my workers a living wage because I'll get arrested if I don't, or because they're owed that injustice, but because I care about my workers and I want to see them do well. I love them. She, the church, lays down precepts yet more perfect and tries to bind class to class in friendliness and good feeling. We'll read a little bit more of this paragraph because it's awesome. The things of earth cannot be understood or valued aright without taking into consideration the life to come, the life that will know no death. Exclude the idea of futurity, and forthwith the very notion of what is good and right would perish. Nay, the whole scheme of the universe would become a dark and unfathomable mystery. The great truth which we learn from nature herself is also the grand Christian dogma on which religion rests as on its foundation, that when we have given up this present life, then we really begin to live. So we can't understand the social question or come up to it with an answer for the social question without religion, because without the notion of the life to come, we have no compass for what is right or wrong, what is good for me to do or bad for me to do. The whole scheme of the universe would become a dark and unfathomable mystery if that was not the perspective that I had. And it's religion that attends to that question of futurity. God has not created us for the perishable and transitory things of earth, but for things heavenly and everlasting. He has given us this world as a place of exile and not as our abiding place. As for riches and the other things which men call good and desirable, whether we have them in abundance or are lacking in them, so far as eternal happiness is concerned, it makes no difference. The only important thing is to use them aright. So the whole perspective of the question shifts once we include futurity, once we include the spiritual nature of the person. Because it's not then just about dispersal of material goods. It's not just about getting more stuff. It's not about being forced to get rid of some of my stuff. The perspective shifts. And we need that in order to address the issues of society properly. And the church persistently, every encyclical, you'll see this mentioned again and again in a different way. As, you know, this is the very start of this separation that we now live with between secular temporal concerns and faith life and religion. Right? Many people in our society today see these as separate spheres that don't intersect. And so what Leo XIII is saying right here at the beginning of this process is you can't even understand this sphere unless you include faith and religion. Right? Because then the things of this world become ends of themselves, and then you will not use them properly. So religion is necessary for solving the social problem. And charity is necessary because it is charity that will push us further than simply fulfilling our obligations. And just as Leo said in 19, that the church is necessary and helps to remind people of their duties to each other, the church with Jesus Christ as her master and guide aims higher still, will become a bigger and bigger part of the Pope's presentations as we go through the centuries. Because a lot of what we need to do in order to make a good society requires sacrifice. And who but they who follow the one who laid down his life for everyone are more inspired to make those types of sacrifices. John Paul II, probably more than any of the other popes, references the cross repeatedly throughout social teaching. So there is a little moral theology to start out with before we get into some really technical stuff. It's always important to remember, though, that ultimately Catholic social teaching is moral theology. The church's goal is not to offer an economic model for everyone to follow. That's not the church's expertise. They say it with great regularity. We're not offering you an economic system. Right? The church does not offer a political model. It offers a moral teaching by which the different nations can choose which political and economic model will work best for their culture. Right? Leo XIII said people should be governed by who they have chosen to govern them in the way that they have chosen to be governed. Right? Very modern political principle. However, of course, they need to talk about politics and the economy in order to explain their moral teaching. So the first thing we're going to look at is the right to private property and the universal destination of goods. You can turn over the page. This was part of my particular focus, so I'll try not to just talk for the remaining 2.5 hours without giving you a break on this topic. The relationship between this principle and the principle of solidarity was my specific focus. And I taught a class at the UW, I can't remember, a couple years ago, focused specifically on the history of private property theory, starting with Plato. Super fun. So feel free, if I start getting off into la-la land, to raise your hands and tell me that I have, sort of left the building. I find it very fascinating just on an intellectual level, so I can sometimes get off track. We're not going to read every word of every single one of these excerpts. That stuff in the smaller font, that's me just giving sort of a summary of what you can find in these passages. So if you come back to this later, you'll be able to read that over and perhaps remember what the paradigm was for choosing these passages. There's a lot more to be said about private property than what I'm going to cover right here in the 20 minutes I'm going to limit myself to. Hopefully all of those things will come up at some point along the next 6 classes. So first we have number 4, which is just a rejection of the socialist proposal. We talked a little bit about the socialist proposal last week. This is a great paragraph. This encyclical was prophetic in its predictions about what the outcome of socialism would be. Remember, it doesn't exist yet anywhere except as a theory. And over again, this document will say, if the socialist system ever gets put into practice, here's what's going to happen. And you hear that and you think, wow, that's precisely what happened. Here he says at the start, 1 through 3, he's listed the wrongs that are present in society, right? Agreed to the critique of the current situation. And then he says, to remedy these wrongs, the socialists, working on the poor man's envy of the rich, are striving to do away with private property and contend that individual possessions should become the common property of all, to be administered by the state or by municipal bodies. They hold that by thus transferring property from private individuals to the community, the present mischievous state of things will be set to rights, inasmuch as each citizen will then get his fair share of whatever there is to enjoy. But their contentions are so clearly powerless to end the controversy that were they carried into effect, the working man himself would be among the first to suffer. They are, moreover, emphatically unjust, for they would rob the lawful possessor, distort the functions of the state, and create utter confusion in the community. So mixing no words there in rejecting the proposal of the collectivization of property. And this document focuses on those specific problems. If you were to read this document specifically for its critique of Marxist socialism. John Paul II would add to that, they completely misunderstand the human person. But because this here is where they want to focus their response, I mean, they'll make a passing reference to the fact that the communists would usurp the role of the family by making the state the primary educator of children, and that they're atheistic, right? Assuming that we would just automatically agree that those were bad things. And the focus of the constructive argument is this issue of property and why they're wrong about that. Now, there's a principle that we have as long ago as Plato, that the goods of the earth, the resources, the natural resources of the earth, are meant to sustain all of the people on the earth. Even the pagan philosophers, as we call them, acknowledged this as part of their understanding of the nature of the world. In Catholic circles, we would say God intended the earth for the sustenance of all. I mentioned it a little bit last month. In our time, this principle has been called the universal destination of goods. The universal destination of goods. The question then becomes immediately, for everyone since Plato, how do we make that happen? The goods and resources of the earth are meant to sustain everyone and give everyone a fully human life. We look around the world, we see that that isn't happening. What do we do about it? We have to come up with a plan for achieving that. It doesn't just spontaneously take place. It requires our solicitude. And then many people, again, ever since Plato, have said that this idea of private ownership that people could take something and call it their own to the exclusion of anyone else having a right over it, threatens the notion that the goods of the earth are meant to sustain everybody. Because if the goods of the earth are meant to sustain everybody, they argue, then everybody is owner of all of it. And so no one could then rightfully take part of it and say, this is mine. Right? And as early as Plato, we see, if you read Plato and you read Aristotle, you see Plato leaning more towards the idea of collective ownership, or at least being understood in that fashion, and Aristotle leaning more towards the defense of private ownership. And this has been something that has been debated since that time. So here's the church addressing that question. In defense, we can already assume from reading number 4 of the right to people to own things as their own, to have an exclusive right. But he begins here in number 8 by acknowledging the universal destination of goods. He says, the fact that God has given the earth for the use and enjoyment of the whole human race can in no way be a bar to the owning of private property. So right off the bat, he's saying that that's not a threat. These principles don't conflict with each other. And here's where he's blatantly stealing from St. Thomas. For God has granted the earth to mankind in general, not in the sense that all without distinction can deal with it as they like, but rather that no part of it was assigned to anyone in particular, and that the limits of private possession have been left to be fixed by man's own industry and by the laws of individual races. So what does that mean? He says, yes, God has given the earth for the use and enjoyment of the whole human race. This is true. But not so that everybody had a right to use anything however they felt like it. Not so that everyone could, without distinction, deal with it as they like. What that means is no part was assigned to anyone in particular. There's nothing in creation, in any piece of the created world, that says, by nature, I am destined to be owned by this person. Right? There's nothing in a field that says, I'm Farmer Brown's field, God created me for Farmer Brown. That's what we mean when we say God has given the earth for the use and enjoyment of the whole human race. It doesn't mean that we can all just willy-nilly use it however we like. Farmer Brown could plant some seed, grow some corn, and Farmer Jim could come and take it all because the earth was destined for everybody. It just means that these things in themselves, it's not inscribed in their nature how they are to be apportioned. The limits have been left to be fixed by man's own industry. That is, how to best use these resources, how to best be sure that they do see to the needs of all, God has left up to us to figure out. And it can be different from place to place, he suggests, when he says left to be fixed by man's own industry and by the laws of individual races. That suggests to me that there would be multiple different ways of figuring out how to best do that. And again, to use my constant analogy of the family, you could have any number of different rules or plans for figuring out how everyone gets to use the one computer that you own, say. There's a limited amount of some resource that everybody needs. How do we make sure everybody gets what they're due? You could come up with any different number of ways of pulling that off. And some might be better than others. Some might be more appropriate in some homes than others. Right? But the goal is the same. And so that's what Leo XIII is saying here, that God intended the earth for all does not mean that all without distinction own everything. It means that there's nothing in the nature of the thing itself that means it belongs to somebody. Right? This is my pen, but there's nothing in the essence of this pen that says Connie Nielsen's pen. Right? We've just come up with a system by which we all can get a hold of pens when we need them and keep them. Does that make sense? Do you see the distinction? And what happens is private property becomes the most rational means for achieving the universal destination of goods. So private property does not come in as a threat to the universal destination of goods. Private property comes in as the limits that have been fixed by man's own industry. That's our means of achieving the universal destination of goods. St. Thomas, yes, ma'am.
How does inheritance come into that universal man's industry?
That's a good question. I'm going to write it down, and we will come back to it. The short answer is that the head of a family is inspired to exert his efforts for the good of his family. And so it is not unjust that what he acquires over his lifetime belongs to his family after he is gone. That would be the short answer. But Monsignor Bertiller would like to add.
It's tempered also by the fact that there's no fees in perpetuity in real estate transfers. With inheritance, so you can't keep in family lineage forever either. So there'd be a...
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite understand that.
So like in real estate transfers in the English common law system, there's no fee transfers in perpetuity to a family. You can't isolate your real estate to your family forever in a single transaction.
Oh, like I can't write a will that says no one can ever own this but a Nielsen. I can just say Joe Nielsen gets this.
Yeah.
And then Joe Nielsen can do whatever he wants with it. He could give it to the church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To protect against an excessive private property interest.
Oh, yeah.
Liabilities of wealth accumulating.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you, Monsignor. Okay. So private property comes in then as a means of achieving the universal destination of goods. St. Thomas Aquinas, on whom I made a little joke before, but this document relies very heavily on the private property theory of St. Thomas. And St. Thomas, of course, I'm sure you all know, relies very heavily on the philosophy of Aristotle. And St. Thomas lists 3 reasons why private property is the most rational ordering of the goods of the earth. If you're interested, this comes from the Secunda Secundae, question 66. I think it's the 2nd article. It's interesting, too, because question 66 is about theft, and that's where you get the bulk of St. Thomas's private property theory. So these are the 3 reasons. First, I'll just read them straight from the translation I have of St. Thomas, and then I'll break them down into simpler words. So first, because every man is more careful to procure what is for himself alone than that which is common to many or to all, since each one would shirk the labor and leave to another that which concerns the community, as happens when there is a great number of servants. So if you know you are working for your own advancement, you will be much more careful and committed to your work than if you are working for the group. Now, this is just a very practical assessment. Right? St. Thomas isn't discussing how to become a saint here. Right? He's discussing the reality of the way the human being works. And we are more careful to procure what is for ourselves than for the group. And you could think of any number of countless examples of this. One that I always mention is, imagine in your head the difference between a public restroom and the restroom in your house, right? Why does a public restroom get trashed so easily? Because everyone just sort of uses it and thinks it's somebody else's problem and lets it go. But if you dropped a paper towel in your own bathroom, you'd probably pick it up. Another really good example from my own experience is restaurants where the tips are shared among the waitstaff. It is the worst thing you can do. If you ever own a restaurant, don't ever do that. You'll have the worst service in town. Right? Because when you know that whatever effort you're putting into your job is not going to benefit you, you just instinctively kind of slack off. Especially if everyone else is slacking off. You think, well, why am I going to go, just so these people can go home with more money? Again, we're not talking about the path to sanctity here. We're talking about, normal human behavior. People will work harder. And so if people will work harder for what they know will benefit themselves, then don't you want a society employing it sort of a system if it's going to make everybody work harder, right? You'll have greater resources. So that's the first reason why St. Thomas says private property is the most rational means of distribution. Secondly, because human affairs are conducted in more orderly fashion if each man is charged with taking care of some particular thing himself, whereas there would be confusion if everyone had to look after any one thing indeterminately. That is just pure practical wisdom, right? If you want something to be taken care of, you put it in some one person's hand. Give some one person the job of taking care of that thing. You don't say, hey, everybody, make sure that's okay, because they'll all just assume somebody else is doing it, and no one will do it. So there's more order if specific people have been given charge with specific things. There is more order if specific people are given charge of specific things. So if you had a giant, well, whatever. Does it make sense? I could go on and on with analogies. So that's number 2. 1 is people are more careful to procure what is for themselves alone. 2, human affairs are more orderly if specific people have responsibility for specific things. Thirdly, because a more peaceful state is ensured to man if each one is contented with his own. Hence it is to be observed that quarrels arise more frequently where there is no division of the things possessed. So if people are content with what they have as their own, there's less strife. Because if everybody's sharing something, then there's a lot of argument over who gets it when and why does he have it now and I never get it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's better if everyone is content with their own thing. They have it, they're at peace. Can I have 5 more minutes? Okay. I can have 8. Excellent. I'm just going to finish this up then. The next paragraph, 9, he talks about how everyone still, even with private property, is being ministered to by the goods of the earth, because no one is being ministered to by the goods of anything else. And so in 9 he says, here again we have further proof. So he says, no one is sustained by the goods of the earth without the labor and influence of the human person. It requires our effort to bring the fruits of the earth out of the earth. And he says, here again we have further proof that private ownership is in accordance with the law of nature. Truly, that which is required for the preservation of life and for life's well-being is produced in great abundance from the soil, but not until man has brought it into cultivation and expended upon it his solicitude and skill. Now, when man thus turns the activity of his mind and the strength of his body toward procuring the fruits of nature, by such act he makes his own that portion of nature's field which he cultivates, that portion on which he leaves, as it were, the impress of his personality. And it cannot be but just that he should possess that portion as his very own, and have a right to hold it without anyone being justified in violating that right. Now, this principle is called by academic types the cultivation principle. And this didn't really become a part of the discussion of private property theory until, a strong part until, say, the 1600s. Probably mostly because people had slaves who were doing all the cultivating for them, and they didn't want to admit that doing the work gave you some right to the ownership, right? But it becomes an important part of private property, and it makes sense. I think it is almost prima facie attractive. When a person works on something and exerts efforts in order to produce fruit, they have a right to that fruit that other people don't have. That has to be just, says Pope Leo XIII. My example before, if Farmer Brown tilled the earth and planted the seeds and watered the seeds and grew the corn and labored and brought fruit out of the earth, it would seem to be completely unjust for someone else to be able to come along and say the goods of the earth were meant to sustain everybody and pick all that corn and run off with it. It wouldn't have even existed if the first man hadn't done the work. And so that's why Rerum Novarum says we imprint our personality on the things that we cultivate. And that gives us a certain right over how they're going to be used. I always joke about this because I think this is very natural. A 5-year-old has a natural sense of this principle. Right? But I think about in my house growing up, there are 7 kids, so 9 people in the house. And if somebody was cooking, the kitchen all of a sudden became my kitchen. Right? Get out of my kitchen. It's my kitchen because I'm the one using it and working it and cultivating it, right? We didn't so much say get out of my kitchen when we were the ones doing the dishes. And it's like, hey everyone, this is a community here, right? But when you were cooking, it was get out of my kitchen. So there is, just very brief, superficial look at the defense for why private property not only does not detract from the universal destination of goods, but is meant to achieve the universal destination of goods. We'll take a little break now and then finish up with the distinction between ownership and use, and then we'll move on to some other principles. So thank you.